Good evening and welcome back to Almighty Sleep. She was born illegitimate, raised in secrets, married the wrong man, fell for the right one, and spent her most alive years on a ship that the law wanted to sink. Anne Bonny did not stumble into piracy by accident. She walked toward it with open eyes and a cutlass she apparently knew how to use. Tonight we trace her entire story, from the quiet scandal of her birth in Cork to the courtrooms of Jamaica, and then into the mystery of what came after. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you are settling in, tell me where you are listening from tonight and what time it is in your corner of the world. I always love seeing the spread of places that join us for these late-night dives into history. Now dim the lights, maybe let a fan hum in the background, and let us ease into tonight's journey together. The world before Anne, pirates, colonies, and the Atlantic stage. To understand Anne Bonny, you first have to understand the world she was born into. Not the romanticised version with gleaming cutlasses and dramatic flags snapping in a perfect wind. The real world. The one that made piracy not only possible, but in certain circles, almost logical. The Atlantic in the late 1600s and early 1700s was a place of staggering contradictions. Immense wealth moved across its surface every single day. Sugar and tobacco and indigo and silver and enslaved human beings all loaded into the hulls of ships and carried between continents by men who were often underpaid, frequently abused, and occasionally desperate enough to do something about it. The great European empires, England, Spain, France, Portugal, the Netherlands, had been carving the Atlantic world into competing spheres of influence for nearly 2 centuries by the time Anne Bonny arrived in it. Spain had come first, establishing its grip on vast stretches of the Caribbean and the American mainland. England followed, planting colonies along the eastern coast of North America and on the islands of the Caribbean. The French and Dutch pushed their own claims. By the late 1600s, the Caribbean Sea in particular had become one of the most contested and commercially vital bodies of water on the planet. The islands were rich, the sea lanes connecting them carried enormous value, and that value made the whole region a target. This is where the pirate enters the story, because pirates did not invent themselves in a vacuum. They were, in many ways, a product of the system they preyed upon. The same imperial competition that filled Caribbean waters with treasure ships also created the conditions that bred piracy. Sailors were employed when wars were being fought and discarded when peace treaties were signed. The English crown had spent the better part of the 1600s using privateers, which were essentially government-licensed pirates, to harass Spanish shipping and claim a share of the spoils. Men like Francis Drake and Henry Morgan were celebrated as heroes in England while being denounced as thieves everywhere else. The line between privateer and pirate was always a matter of paperwork. When the paperwork expired, the man did not change, only his legal status did. By the time the 17th century was drawing toward its close, the Caribbean had developed a shadow economy that ran parallel to the official one. Pirates and the communities that sheltered them resupplied them, bought their stolen goods, and occasionally married their children had become a fact of Caribbean life. Port Royal in Jamaica had spent decades as one of the most notoriously permissive harbours in the Atlantic world, a place where pirate captains were received almost as merchant princes, and their cargoes were sold with a wink and a comfortable profit margin for everyone involved. Port Royal was eventually swallowed by the sea in a famous earthquake in 1692, which a great many people at the time interpreted as divine judgment. Whether or not you believe in divine judgment, the earthquake did not end piracy. It barely slowed it down. What followed in the early 1700s is the period historians now call the Golden Age of piracy. This is roughly the stretch from around 1690 to 1730 or so, and it produced the names that most people still associate with the word pirate. Blackbeard, Bartholomew Roberts, Charles Vane, Benjamin Hornigold, and yes, Calico Jack Rackham. These were not isolated figures operating alone in remote waters. They were part of a loose but recognizable world with shared customs, shared ports, shared enemies, and in some cases shared articles of agreement that governed how prizes were divided and how injuries were compensated. There is a reason some historians have called pirate ships of this era among the most democratic institutions in the Atlantic world. That might be pushing it slightly, but the point is not entirely wrong. The colony of New Providence in the Bahamas, and specifically its main settlement of Nassau, became the spiritual and practical capital of this pirate world. Nassau was a genuinely extraordinary place by the standards of the time. It had a deep, sheltered harbour, It sat at a natural choke point through which enormous amounts of Caribbean shipping passed. Its colonial administration was weak to the point of being nearly fictional, and it attracted the kind of people who preferred their governance minimal and their questions unasked. By the 17-teens, Nassau had become what contemporary observers called a pirate republic, a place where no one really controlled what arrived in the harbour or what left it. Into this world Anne Bonny would eventually sail, but the world also had a more domestic face, one of colonial settlements and tobacco plantations, and the grinding work of building European civilization on American soil. The colonies of the American eastern seaboard were growing in the late 1600s. Charlestown, which we now call Charleston, in the province of Carolina, was a relatively young but already commercially significant settlement. It sat at the mouth of two rivers and had access to the sea, which made it attractive to merchants and planters alike. The planters were building fortunes on the labour of enslaved Africans who worked the crops that made Carolina profitable. The society was hierarchical in the way that colonial societies almost always are, defined by land and lineage and the particular anxieties that come with a community that knows it is a long way from home. This is the world Anne Bonny was born into, or rather the world she was born adjacent to, because Anne did not arrive in Carolina as a planter's legitimate daughter with a clear place in the social order. She arrived as something considerably more complicated, which is where the real story begins. The late 1700s Atlantic world was, in summary, a place of enormous energy and enormous violence. Commerce and exploitation moved through the same channels. Empires competed not just with armies but with trade routes and colonial charters and the strategic placement of sugar cane. Pirates occupied the margins of this system, filling the spaces where imperial authority was thin and opportunity was thick. They were a product of the age, and like all products of their age, the people who became pirates were shaped by forces they did not choose: poverty, abuse, limited options. The particular adventure that an open ocean offers to anyone standing on a shore with nothing worth staying for. Anne Bonny was not born poor. That is one of the things that makes her interesting. She did not turn to piracy because she had no other option. She turned to it because the option she'd been given did not satisfy her, and that is a different kind of story entirely. More complicated, more interesting, and honestly more relatable than we might initially want to admit. Before we follow her life directly, it is worth spending a moment with the sea itself. The Caribbean in the early 1700s was a place of staggering natural beauty and equally staggering danger. Hurricanes swept through with little warning. Shoals and reefs could open the bottom of a ship with no more noise than a long, slow groan. Disease moved through crews with terrifying efficiency. Yellow fever, dysentery, scurvy, and a dozen other ailments treated the human body as an obstacle rather than a home. The ships themselves were cramped, damp, loud with the grinding of rigging and the crash of water and perpetually smelling of salt and sweat and bilge. To choose this life was to choose hardship. The romantic version of piracy tends to skip over the part where the hammock is swinging in a sea so rough that sleep is impossible, and the water ration has been cut because the casks are going bad. It tends to skip over the part where a prize ship turns out to be carrying nothing worth risking your life for. It skips the long stretches of nothing between one raid and the next. What the romantic version keeps is the freedom, and freedom was real. For people who had very little of it on land, the sea offered something rare and intoxicating. The feeling that the rules applied to someone else. Anne Bonny would feel that pull. But first she had to be born, and that already came with complications. Cork and secrets. The illegitimate birth of a legend. Every good story has a beginning that nobody was supposed to talk about. Anne Bonny's is better than most. The year was around 1697, give or take a year or two, because records from this period and this particular household were not kept with the kind of precision that would make a historian's life comfortable. Anne was born in County Cork, Ireland. County Cork sits in the south of Ireland, a landscape of green hills and grey sea and the particular kind of rain that does not hurry. Cork City itself was a merchant town, built on trade with England and the European continent, shaped by the kind of commercial ambition that tends to produce both wealth and the social tensions that wealth creates. It was not a bad place to be born if you were born into the right circumstances. Anne was not. Her father was a man named William Cormac. He was a lawyer by profession, a respectable member of Cork's merchant class, and a married man with a wife who was none of what happened next. William Cormac had an affair with a woman named Mary Brennan. Some accounts call Mary a servant in the Cormac household, others suggest a slightly less domestic connection, but all of them agree on the essential point. Mary Brennan was not William Cormac's wife, and yet from their relationship came a child, a girl, born into the particular complicated silence that surrounds illegitimate births in deeply Catholic, deeply socially stratified communities. Anne Bonny, the pirate, the legend, the woman who would one day stand on a deck with a weapon in her hand while grown men hid below, began life as a secret that Cork's respectable society was slowly failing to keep. The story of what happened next has come down to us in several versions, and the honest thing to say is that the details are contested. What most accounts agree on is a basic shape. William Cormac, faced with a scandal that was threatening to become undeniable, eventually made a decision to leave Ireland. Whether this was primarily to escape the social consequences of the affair, or because he genuinely wanted to build a new life with Mary Brennan and his daughter, is something that the historical record does not settle with certainty. People are complicated, and William Cormac was a person. He probably had more than one reason. What is clear is that at some point in the early 1700s, William Cormac gathered himself together and emigrated. He was heading to the American colonies, specifically to the Carolina colony, which was at that point still being divided into its northern and southern halves, and was offering the kind of commercial opportunities that attracted ambitious men who wanted to start fresh. Mary Brennan came with him. Anne, still a small child, came with them. Now here is the part that gives you a sense of William Cormac's particular practical creativity. On the voyage over, and possibly during the period in Cork before they left, William apparently dressed the young Anne as a boy, and presented Mary Brennan not as his lover, but as his clerk's wife. This was the cover story. It did not fool everyone, accounts suggest, but it served its purpose long enough for the family to cross an ocean and arrive on new shores where no one had pre-existing opinions about the arrangement. There is something almost endearing about this, if you set aside the deception involved. William Cormac, respectable Cork lawyer, had a problem that could not be solved within the rules of the world he lived in, and so he left that world, found a different one, and brought the people he apparently actually cared about with him. Whatever else you say about him, he was not the kind of man who simply abandoned an inconvenient woman and disappeared. He packed everyone into a ship and took them to Carolina. This is not nothing. Anne herself was too young to have any memory of Cork that would have stayed with her into adulthood, or at least too young for the kind of formative memory that shapes identity. Her island was not a felt place for her. It was a fact of origin, a point on a map that explained an accent and a certain set of facial features, but not much else. She was a Carolina child in every meaningful sense by the time she was old enough to be anyone at all. The crossing of the Atlantic in the early 1700s was not a comfortable experience even for people who had paid for passage. Ships were not large by modern standards. The ocean in autumn could be violently rough. Passengers were confined to cramped quarters that lacked ventilation, privacy, and adequate food. For a small child accompanied by a mother navigating a complicated social situation and a father pretending nothing unusual was happening, it must have been an interesting few weeks at sea. What it was not, we can be reasonably certain, was Anne's last time on a ship. There is a particular quality to the childhoods of people who later become legends. Looking backward, we tend to find the early signs, the hints of what was coming. In Anne's case, the signs are there if you want them. She was born outside the rules. She arrived at her new life already wearing a costume, already playing a role her father had assigned her. She came to America in secret and in motion. Every one of those facts would echo through the rest of her life. Cork in the 1690s was a city shaped by Protestant English rule and Catholic Irish resentment, by merchant ambition and grinding poverty, by the remnants of Gaelic culture and the aggressive imposition of English law and custom. The Cormac family was on the Protestant, professionally successful side of this divide. William Cormac was a lawyer, a member of the commercial class that was doing reasonably well under English rule even if the politics around them were volatile. The scandal of his affair would have hit a family like his particularly hard, because respectability was not just a social nicety for people in his position. It was the substance of his professional reputation. Lawyers in Cork in 1697 needed people to trust them. A man whose private life was a source of public gossip was a man whose client list might start to thin. This is probably why Cork began to feel uninhabitable once Mary Brennan's condition became obvious. And it is probably why Carolina, which was far away and growing fast and not particularly interested in anyone's Irish romantic history, looked so attractive. For Mary Brennan, the journey was also a form of liberation, though a costly one. She had left behind whatever she had before, whether that was family, a community, a sense of belonging, to cross an ocean with a man who could not or would not make her his wife in the country where he was known. She was betting on the New World and on William Cormac in equal measure. That is a significant bet to place. In Carolina, they arrived into a world that was building itself fast and not always carefully. Land was the currency of the colony, and William Cormac, a man with legal training and apparently some means, was well positioned to acquire it. What the family found in Carolina, what Anne grew up in, we will explore in the next chapter. But before we leave Cork and the secret origins of our subject, there is one more thing worth noting. Ireland in the late 1700s had its own tradition of people who lived outside the law, people who operated in the spaces between English authority and Irish community, people who moved fast and answered to unconventional authorities. Anne Bonny was not shaped by that tradition in any direct way. She left too young. But she came from a place where resistance to imposed order was not merely theoretical, but woven into the daily texture of life, where rules about who you were allowed to be and who you were allowed to love had always sat uneasily with the people being ruled. Something of that unease, something of that restlessness, might have travelled with her across the water without her knowing it was there. Or maybe she just had a difficult father and a wild temper, and the particular kind of stubborn clarity that some people are simply born with. Either way, she arrived in Carolina, small and unannounced and full of futures she could not yet see. Carolina soil, a new world, a new life. Carolina in the early 1700s was the kind of place that rewarded ambition and punished weakness in roughly equal measure. It was not yet the divided state it would become, though the division between northern and southern Carolina was already in practical terms well underway. The settlement of Charlestown, sitting at the confluence of the Ashley and Cooper rivers near the coast, was the commercial heart of the southern portion. It had been founded in 1670, which means it was barely a generation old when the Cormac family arrived. For a settlement so young, it had accumulated a remarkable amount of money, a significant amount of social anxiety, and an architectural ambition that already exceeded what the surrounding wilderness strictly required. William Cormac did well in Carolina. This matters for understanding Anne's childhood, because she did not grow up in poverty. She grew up in a household that was, by the standards of the colony, prosperous. William's legal training transferred readily to a colonial setting hungry for people who understood how to navigate property disputes, merchant contracts, and the complicated legal machinery of a growing commercial society. He built a practice. He acquired land. He eventually became a planter of some standing, which in Carolina in the 1700s meant he was overseeing agricultural operations worked by enslaved people, and the crops that those operations produced, primarily indigo and some tobacco, fed into the larger Atlantic commercial system. The household Anne grew up in was therefore a place of contradictions, comfortable by colonial standards, built on a foundation that polite society preferred not to examine too closely. The Cormac family's own origins in Carolina were rooted in an irregularity that had been carefully papered over, and the wealth they were accumulating was rooted in a system of human bondage that the colony's planters preferred to frame as simple economic necessity. Anne was surrounded, in other words, by respectably maintained fictions. This may have made her unusually perceptive about the difference between the official story and the real one. Mary Brennan, Anne's mother, appears in the historical record primarily through the consequences of her choices rather than through any direct documentation of her own voice or perspective. We know she made the crossing. We know she built a life in Carolina with William Cormac. Some accounts suggest that William did eventually formalize his relationship with her in some way, though whether this constituted a legal marriage given the prior circumstances is not entirely clear. What seems certain is that Anne was raised in her father's household with his name and something approximating his protection. She was not discarded. She was not sent away. She was, within the limits of the situation, claimed. This is not insignificant. The experience of being illegitimate in colonial society was enormously variable, depending on how the father chose to handle it. Some men acknowledged their children quietly and made provision for them. Others did not. William Cormac was among those who did, and the effect on Anne was that she grew up with access to resources, education and social standing that many girls of her era did not have. She could read. She could write. She had some education in the kind of subjects that marked a person as belonging to the class her father was building toward. At the same time, she was always aware, or at least could become aware if the wrong person chose to remind her, of the irregularity at the heart of her family's situation. There is a particular psychology that can develop in people who grow up in this kind of position, an awareness of social rules combined with a certain distance from them. a knowledge of how the world expects things to look combined with a lived experience that does not quite match the picture. Some people who grow up this way spend their lives in anxious pursuit of legitimacy, working constantly to prove that they belong. Others go the other direction entirely. They decide that if the rules were not actually made for them, they are not actually obliged to follow the rules. Anne Bonny, it will become clear, was firmly in the second category. Her childhood in Carolina has been described in various ways by various sources, and the honest thing to say is that most of the colourful details that circulate about Anne's early years are probably apocryphal. There is a famous story that circulates about young Anne stabbing a servant girl with a knife in a fit of temper, a story that almost certainly grew in the retelling over the decades after her death. There are accounts of a ferocious temperament, a willingness to use physical force that was distinctly out of keeping with what was expected of a girl of her social class. These stories may contain some truth, or they may be the kind of retrospective invention that attaches itself to people who later become famous for unconventional behaviour. What we can say with reasonable confidence is that Anne grew up in a colonial household with access to both the privileges of her father's class and the open landscape of a relatively new settlement. Carolina in the early 1700s was not a tightly controlled urban environment. It was a frontier in the process of becoming something more settled, and frontiers have a different relationship to the rules than established societies do. Children growing up on frontiers grow up with more physical freedom, more contact with the natural world, more awareness of the practical realities of survival. This tends to produce people who are less impressed by social performances and more interested in what actually works. Charlestown itself was a busy, cosmopolitan place for a colonial settlement. Its harbour brought in ships from England, from the Caribbean, from the West African coast with its cargo of enslaved people, from the various other colonies of the eastern seaboard. The docks and warehouses were full of goods and full of people moving those goods, and the conversations that moved through the waterfront taverns carried news from all over the Atlantic world. A curious child in Charlestown could learn a great deal just by listening. About the Caribbean, about trade routes, about what was happening in Nassau, where, by the 17-teens, the Pirate Republic was in full swing. Anne grew toward adulthood in this environment. We do not know much in specific detail about her teenage years, though we know they culminated in the decision that would define her early adult life, and eventually prove, in retrospect, to have been rather a significant mistake. But before that mistake, there was her father's household to grow up in, the plantation, the work of the colony, the social rounds of Charlestown, and somewhere in all of that, a girl with a temper and a restlessness and apparently an increasingly pressing sense that the life her father's success had made available to her was not quite large enough to contain her. Carolina planters' daughters were expected to marry. This was the trajectory that the colony's social world had available for girls of Anne's class. You married a man of appropriate standing, you managed a household, you produced children, you contributed to the social fabric of the community through the correct performance of gentility. This was not a terrible life by the standards of the time. Many women lived it without obvious distress. But for Anne Bonny, it must have felt like a description of a cage that someone was proposing she enter voluntarily. The world beyond the harbour was wide and full of motion. Ships came in and went out every day carrying the evidence of a much larger existence. The stories that moved through the waterfront were not stories about managed households and appropriate marriages. They were stories about hurricanes and treasure, and men who had taken their lives into their own hands on the open sea. Anne grew up hearing all of it, absorbing all of it, and filing it away in whatever part of her that was already calculating the distance between where she was and where she might eventually be. William Cormac, it seems, had plans for his daughter that did not include the sea. He wanted her settled. He wanted her respectable. He wanted, perhaps, the legitimacy for her that he had never quite been able to provide the circumstances for. This is understandable. It is also the kind of well-intentioned parental pressure that has a long history of producing precisely the opposite of its intended effect. James Bonny and the First Mistake. At some point in the early 1720s, probably around 1718 or 1719, though the records are not precise enough to be certain, Anne Cormac met a man named James Bonny, and here we arrive at what is, by any reasonable measure, one of the less impressive romantic decisions in the historical record. Not the worst. History has produced worse, but firmly in the category of choices that look considerably more explicable in the moment than they do in retrospect. James Bonny was a sailor. He was also, depending on which account you favour, either a small-time pirate or a man with pirate-adjacent associations who occupied the margins of Nassau's chaotic maritime world, without ever quite committing fully to any of it. He was not wealthy. He was not distinguished by any quality that the historical record has thought worth preserving. He was a man of the sea with uncertain prospects and, apparently, sufficient charm or novelty or simple availability to convince Anne Cormack that marrying him was a reasonable idea. It was not a reasonable idea, but we are getting ahead of ourselves. The story as it has come down through the accounts is straightforward in its shape, even where the details are contested. Anne fell for James Bonny, William Cormack, who had spent the better part of 2 decades building a respectable life in Carolina, and who presumably had specific ideas about the kind of marriage that would appropriately crown that effort, was furious. The accounts agree on the fury even where they disagree on particulars. Father disapproved. Daughter was entirely unmoved by the disapproval. The marriage happened, reportedly without William's blessing, possibly arranged quietly in a way designed to present her father with a situation he could not undo rather than a proposal he could argue against. This is a tactic with a long history and a mixed success rate, and in Anne's case it produced the expected result. The marriage happened. The approval did not follow. I want to be fair to the decision, because it is easy to look backward from the knowledge of how James Bonny turned out and treat the whole thing as simply foolish. It was not simply foolish. It was the kind of choice that makes complete sense when you're young and feeling 2 opposing pressures simultaneously. The pressure of adventure pulling in one direction, the pressure of a prescribed life pushing from the other. James Bonny was not what Anne was supposed to want. He was not a planter's son with land and prospects. He was not a merchant with a counting house and a social position. He was not a lawyer's apprentice or a colonial official or any of the other categories of eligible man that William Cormack's household would have presented as appropriate. He was precisely the kind of man that respectable colonial society maintained a specific vocabulary for warning its daughters away from, and he was connected, however loosely and unimpressively, to the world of the sea that Anne had been watching from the harbour for as long as she could remember. Seen from inside the situation, in the 17 teens, in a Carolina that was comfortable and stable and entirely mapped out for her, James Bonny was a door. He was not a particularly good door. He did not lead anywhere especially promising, but he led somewhere different from where she was standing, and different at that particular moment may have been enough. Here is what the historical record has preserved most durably about James Bonny, and I think it is worth stating plainly. He was not very impressive. This is not a harsh judgment from posterity. It is the consistent assessment of virtually every source that recorded an opinion about him. He was described as weak. He was described as a man who found informing on other pirates more congenial than actually being one, which in Nassau was about as socially damaging a reputation as you could develop. He was described as someone who spent considerable time in the harbour taverns drinking, and considerably more time than was dignified complaining about his wife once she left him. None of this makes him a villain exactly. Some people are simply not the heroes of the story they end up in. James Bonny was emphatically one of those people, a supporting character who briefly occupied centre stage through the accident of Anne's attention, and then retreated to the margins where the historical record last finds him, still complaining. But Anne did not know this in the 17 teens, or if she knew it, she was measuring it against the specific alternative, which was remaining in Carolina and marrying whoever her father selected, and living out the life that William Cormack's success had made available for her, a plantation wife, a respectable household, the social rounds of Charlestown conducted in the correct clothing with the correct expressions. When you measure James Bonny against that alternative, rather than against the abstract standard of what a good husband should be, he looks slightly less implausible. He represented motion. He represented the sea. He represented, in the only form currently available to Anne, the refusal of the trajectory that had been designed for her without her input. These are not nothing, even when the specific vehicle for them turns out to be someone who will later make his living, telling colonial governors where his wife's friends are sleeping. William Cormack's response to the marriage was, by most accounts, to disown his daughter. The precise nature of this break is not fully clear in the historical record. Whether it was a formal and complete severing or something messier and more ambiguous is difficult to say. What seems certain is that the comfortable life in Carolina, the access to her father's wealth, the standing that his name had provided her, was now effectively closed. She had made her choice, and William Cormack, a man who had made a spectacularly unconventional choice of his own a generation earlier, drew the line at his daughter's unsuitable marriage. I cannot let this irony pass without comment, because it is genuinely remarkable. William Cormac, who had conducted an affair with a woman in his household, fathered an illegitimate child, abandoned his wife and his country, crossed an ocean under a cover story and dressed his infant daughter as a boy to conceal her existence from polite society, was now disowning that same daughter for marrying below her station. History is full of parents who become significantly more conservative once they have acquired something worth protecting. William Cormac was a case study in this phenomenon. He had bent every available rule to build a respectable life in Carolina. The last thing he wanted was his daughter dismantling the respectability from the inside. Anne and James Bonny found themselves in the early 1720s with limited options in Carolina and the sea pulling them southward. Nassau was the logical destination. It was where people like James Bonny belonged, in the loose and sun-baked harbour world of the Bahamas, where questions about a man's history were not frequently asked, and the distinction between legitimate and illegitimate commerce was treated as largely theoretical. Nassau had grown, through the first 2 decades of the century, into the capital of Caribbean piracy, the place where the men the authorities were looking for went when they needed a port that was not looking for them. They went to Nassau. And James Bonny, freed from the constraints of Carolina's social world and returned to the environment that suited him, proceeded to be exactly what he had always been. He drank. He associated with the pirate community in a peripheral and uninspiring way. He found employment, or something he called employment, as an informer for the colonial authorities. In Nassau, telling the authorities which pirates were where and what they had done was not merely professionally uninspiring, it was a form of social suicide. The community's relationship with colonial authority was based entirely on the authorities' willingness to not ask too many questions. A man who was actively answering those questions on behalf of the governor was a man the community could not trust, and in a place where trust was the primary currency, being untrustworthy was about as damaging as it was possible to be. Anne Bonny had married a man who was, in every sense that Nassau understood, not to be trusted. She had also married a man who was not exciting, not successful, not capable of providing anything that made the loss of her father's approval feel like a fair exchange. The marriage was a mistake. Anne would have understood this relatively quickly. The question was what she was going to do about it. The answer to that question required understanding what Nassau actually was and what it contained, because Nassau in the early 1720s was not simply a harbour full of disappointing men like James Bonny. It was something considerably more interesting than that. It was a community in the middle of a collision between its old identity and the new order that Woodes Rogers was trying to impose on it. It was full of energy and possibility and danger, and men who had lived outside the rules for so long that respectability felt like a foreign language. And somewhere in its taverns, wearing his calico print clothing and nursing the particular boredom of a pirate captain living on a pardon, was John Rackham. Nassau was exactly the wrong place to take a woman like Anne Bonny if you were hoping to keep her. She had already outgrown James Bonny before she understood what outgrowing him meant. Nassau simply provided the specific person and the specific opportunity that made the next chapter possible. The marriage was a mistake, but it was the mistake that got her to Nassau, and Nassau was where the real story began. Nassau, the Republic of Pirates Nassau in the 17-teens and early 1720s, was not a place you would find on most official maps of the British Empire with any kind of pride. It was the capital of the Bahamas in a technical sense, the main settlement on the island of New Providence. But the Bahamian colonial administration had essentially collapsed by the early 1700s, leaving the islands ungoverned in any practical sense. The local governor, when there was one, had very little actual authority over what arrived in or departed from Nassau's harbour. The harbour itself, sheltered and accessible and sitting directly on the route that Spanish treasure ships and merchant vessels used when sailing from the Caribbean toward Europe, was the whole point. Pirates knew a good location when they found one. Benjamin Hornigold arrived in Nassau sometime around 1713 and began building what would become the Pirate Republic in collaboration with other captains who were drawn to the harbour for exactly the same reasons. The community that developed was genuinely unusual. Pirates operated from Nassau in large numbers, selling their prizes to local merchants who did not ask uncomfortable questions, spending their shares in the taverns and brothels that proliferated to serve the demand, and living in something resembling a community with its own social codes, even if those codes bore only a passing resemblance to the ones operating in London or Charlestown or Port Royal. The pirate code, which varied somewhat from ship to ship, was a practical document rather than a philosophical one. It existed because pirates needed to regulate their own behaviour in the absence of external authority. A share of the prizes was distributed according to rank and role. Injuries sustained in action were compensated according to a schedule. The captain's authority was real but not absolute, and in some cases the crew had the right to vote the captain out of his position if they felt he was leading them poorly. By the standards of the time, these were remarkably democratic arrangements. By the standards of maritime employment in general, where sailors were regularly flogged, impressed, starved, and cheated, they were almost utopian. This is not to say that pirates were admirable people in any comprehensive moral sense. They were not. They killed. They enslaved. They terrorized. They operated through violence and the threat of violence, and the violence was real. The pirates of Nassau's golden age were not misunderstood freedom fighters. They were thieves operating in an extraordinarily dangerous profession, and many of the people they robbed were also not wealthy. The romantic version of piracy has a tendency to focus on the treasure galleons and the Spanish silver, which gives the impression of a Robin Hood dynamic that the historical record does not really support. A merchant ship carrying cloth and food could get robbed just as thoroughly as a galleon carrying gold, and the people aboard it were no less terrified. What Nassau offered was freedom from one specific kind of oppression, the oppression of a maritime labour system that treated sailors as disposable, and the oppression of a colonial social order that had very narrow definitions of who was allowed to be what. For men who had been ground down by that system, Nassau was an alternative. A hard and violent and frequently fatal alternative, but an alternative nonetheless. The choice of piracy was often the choice of a man who had run out of other options, and decided he would rather take his chances on the sea than continue being slowly destroyed on shore. Women in Nassau occupied a more complicated position. The Pirate Republic was not exactly a feminist utopia. Women were present in Nassau in several capacities, as wives, as sex workers, as the partners of pirates who came and went with the tides. They were part of the economy and the social fabric of the settlement, but the world of the ships was almost exclusively male. To actually go to sea as a pirate, to be part of a crew, to fight and navigate and share in the prizes, was something that women were not supposed to do and that most captains would have refused to permit. The few women who did make it aboard pirate ships, and there were some, tended to do so either in disguise or through the exceptional circumstances of their particular situation. Anne Bonny and Mary Read, whose story we will come to shortly, were remarkable partly because they managed to be present on a pirate ship without disguise, or at least without disguise for very long, in a world that was actively hostile to their presence. Nassau was also, it must be said, a genuinely chaotic place. The settlement itself was not much to look at. Wooden structures around the harbour, taverns that were really just rooms with liquor in them, a population that turned over constantly as ships came and went, and men spent their money and went back to sea or were captured or simply disappeared. The smells would have been considerable. The noise was probably relentless. The social texture of the place was that of a frontier community with extra violence and a noted absence of long-term planning. But it was alive. It was full of energy and movement and the particular electricity of a place where the rules were loose, and the possibilities felt genuinely open. After the managed world of Carolina, after her father's plantation, and the social expectations of Charles Town, after the disappointing reality of her marriage to James Bonny, Anne must have found Nassau at least electrifying, if not exactly comfortable. By the time Anne and James arrived in Nassau, the Pirate Republic was actually in the process of being dismantled. The British Crown, recognising that Nassau had become an embarrassment and an economic threat, sent a new governor to the Bahamas in 1718. His name was Woodes Rogers, and he was about as far from a figurehead colonial administrator as it was possible to be. Rogers was a former privateer himself, a man who had sailed around the world and had a practical understanding of both maritime life and the particular psychology of the people he was being sent to govern. He arrived in Nassau in July of 1718 with ships, soldiers, a royal pardon for pirates who surrendered, and a very clear message for those who did not. The pardon, formerly called the King's Pardon, was offered to any pirate who surrendered to the authorities by a specified date. Accept the pardon, retire from piracy, and your past crimes would be officially forgiven. Refuse and be hunted. Many pirates accepted the pardon. Some did not. Among those who did not was a captain named Charles Vane, who sailed his ship out of the harbour firing his guns at Rogers' fleet as he went, which is either the most dramatic possible expression of professional opinion or just extremely stubborn, depending on how you look at it. Among those who eventually found a complicated relationship with the pardon was John Rackham. Nassau under Woodes Rogers was a different place from the pirate republic that had preceded it. The gallows went up. Pirates who violated their pardons and were caught were hanged publicly, a message that Rogers intended every sailor in the Caribbean to receive. The casual atmosphere of the harbour changed. Ships arriving had to account for themselves. The merchants who had grown comfortable profiting from pirate plunder found that the new governor was interested in asking questions about their business practices. For Anne Bonny, arriving into this world with James Bonny, Nassau represented a particular kind of opportunity dressed in a particular kind of disappointment. The Republic was giving way to order. The freedom that had made the place remarkable was being compressed. But the pirates were still there, still drinking in the taverns, still talking about the sea, still carrying the kind of energy that the harbour had always generated. And among them, with his calico print clothes and his history and his eyes on whatever came next, was Calico Jack Rackham. Calico Jack and the choice that changed everything. John Rackham earned his nickname the straightforward way. He liked calico cloth. The brightly printed cotton fabric, bold patterns and vivid colours, was fashionable in certain circles in the early 18th century, and on a pirate captain moving through the harbour taverns of Nassau, it made a particular kind of statement. Whether the statement was intentional vanity or simply a man who knew what he liked and bought it, without worrying too much about the impression it created, is impossible to say at this distance. What is certain is that the name stuck, and Calico Jack Rackham went into history wearing it. He was not a giant. This needs to be established clearly because there is a tendency, when telling Anne Bonny's story, to inflate the man she chose as a way of explaining the choice. Calico Jack Rackham was not Blackbeard. Blackbeard, whose real name was Edward Teach, had by this point already lived and died in the spectacular manner that legends require, having terrorized the American eastern seaboard and been killed in battle off the coast of North Carolina in November of 1718. Rackham was not Bartholomew Roberts either, who was at that very moment in the middle of one of the most extraordinary careers in the history of Atlantic piracy, accumulating prize ships at a rate that would eventually exceed 400, and ranging from the Caribbean to West Africa to the waters off Newfoundland with a confidence that suggested he had not fully processed the concept of consequences. These were the giants of the Golden Age. Rackham was something more modest, a competent captain, a man of genuine courage, a second-tier figure whose name would almost certainly have faded entirely from the historical record if it were not for the company he kept. What he was, apparently, was compelling, or at least compelling enough for Anne Bonny, which, given the specific circumstances of her life at that moment, was not an insignificant bar to clear. Nassau's social world was not large. This is the simple geographical and demographic fact that explains why their meeting happened as quickly as it did. The settlement around the harbour contained a few hundred permanent residents and a rotating population of sailors, pirates, merchants of varying legitimacy, and the various people who made their living supplying all of the above with food, rum, and the other essentials. Everyone who spent any time in Nassau knew everyone else, or knew someone who knew everyone else, and the taverns where information and alcohol circulated served both purposes simultaneously. Anne Bonny and John Rackham were both in Nassau at the same time, moving through the same small social world. Meeting was not a matter of fate, it was a matter of arithmetic. They met. They were attracted to each other. The attraction became an affair with a speed that Nassau's limited capacity for discretion made impossible to conceal. James Bonny knew. Nassau knew. The affair was, within a short time, the kind of open secret that only remains a secret in the most technical sense of the word. Rackham's history up to this point is worth understanding because it shaped what he was when Anne found him. He had served as quartermaster on a pirate vessel, under the command of Captain Charles Vane. The same Charles Vane who had made such a memorably defiant exit from Nassau Harbour in 1718 when Woodes Rogers arrived with his ships and his pardon and his very clear message about the future of piracy in the Bahamas. Vane had sailed out firing his guns at Rogers' fleet, which was either a magnificent gesture of professional contempt or simply an inability to leave a situation without making it worse, depending on your temperament. Rackham had been aboard that ship. In November of 1718, the crew of Vane's vessel reached a collective judgment about their captain. He had declined to attack a French warship, citing the odds as unfavourable. The crew called it cowardice and voted accordingly. Rackham, as quartermaster, was the natural successor. He became captain through the mechanism that the pirate world used for such transitions, which was not inheritance or appointment but a vote. The crew's collective decision that this man rather than that man was more likely to keep them alive and profitable. It was a blunt and effective system, and it had produced Calico Jack as a captain. He had subsequently accepted the king's pardon. This happened sometime in 1719, when Rackham arrived in Nassau and presented himself to Woodes Rogers as a man who had considered his options and decided that the reformed life was the one he wanted. Whether this represented genuine conversion or strategic convenience is a question the historical record resolves fairly clearly by showing that he later went back to sea as a pirate. But for a period, he was in Nassau, legal, present, technically no longer a pirate, and extremely, almost certainly bored. Nassau under Woodes Rogers was not the Nassau that had generated its reputation. The pirate republic that had made the harbour famous was being systematically dismantled. The gallows had gone up. The pardoned pirates were being watched. The merchants who had profited from selling stolen goods were finding the new governor's curiosity about their business practices professionally inconvenient. The atmosphere of the settlement had changed from the loose, ungoverned energy of a place where anything was possible to the tighter, more cautious atmosphere of a place that was in the process of being brought to heel. For a man whose entire adult identity had been organised around the sea and the particular freedom that operating outside the law provides, Nassau under Rogers must have felt like wearing a coat 2 sizes too small. Everything constrained, every direction slightly blocked. Anne Bonny walked into that room, and the room got more interesting immediately. The attraction was apparently not subtle about announcing itself. Nassau's standards for discretion were not, to put it delicately, exacting. Within a short time the affair was known, and James Bonny was among those who knew it. His response to knowing it was, according to the historical record, primarily verbal rather than physical, which is one of the more revealing details we have about the relative characters of the 2 men occupying Anne's life at this particular moment. James Bonny complained. He expressed unhappiness through the medium of complaint to anyone who would listen, which in Nassau was a limited audience given that most people had more pressing concerns. Anne, for her part, wanted to resolve the situation through a mechanism that Nassau recognised even if the law did not. The wife sale was a practice in which a husband effectively transferred his wife to another man in exchange for payment, dissolving the marriage in a way that had no legal standing anywhere that operated proper courts, but that was treated as binding in communities that made their own rules. It sounds, by any modern measure, appalling. Within the specific context of Nassau in 1719, it was actually one of the few available mechanisms by which a woman in a bad marriage could exit it without requiring her husband's cooperative agreement to a formal legal process that he could simply refuse to engage with. Anne proposed it. She wanted out. She was willing to have Rackham pay whatever James Bonny considered appropriate for the transaction. James Bonny refused. And then, in a move that tells you everything you need to know about him, he went to Woodes Rogers and reported the adultery. He told the governor that his wife was involved with John Rackham and that the governor should do something about it. Woodes Rogers, who was managing the transition of a former pirate republic into a functioning British colony and had approximately no spare administrative capacity for domestic disputes, found himself nonetheless in possession of this information and reportedly issued a threat. Anne would be flogged if she did not return to her husband. The flogging threat was not trivial. Public flogging was a real punishment with real physical consequences. It was also a public humiliation, a statement made in front of a community that Anne had to continue living in. Rogers was not bluffing. The threat was meant to close the matter. Anne Bonny's response to the threat was to ignore it entirely and go to sea with Rackham. I want to be precise about what this moment was, because it is easy to describe it in romantic terms that soften its actual texture. This was not a woman being swept off her feet. This was a woman making a calculation. She had looked at the 2 available options. Option 1 was returning to James Bonny, accepting the flogging, resuming a marriage she had already decided was finished, living in a Nassau that was shrinking around her, waiting for whatever came next in a life defined by other people's decisions about what she was supposed to be. Option 2 was getting on a ship with a man she wanted to be with, going to sea and accepting all the consequences that choice would generate, which were considerable, and she almost certainly knew it. She chose option 2, without hesitation, as far as the record suggests, without the kind of visible anguish that later romantic tellings of the story sometimes insert into the moment. She chose the sea. She chose the risk she was choosing over the risk she was being assigned. She was in her early 20s. She had already crossed an ocean once, left her father's house, made a bad marriage, and survived the disappointment of discovering that the bad marriage was exactly as bad as it looked. She knew something about the cost of choosing wrong. She also apparently knew, with the clarity that some people have and others never develop, the difference between the risk of going and the risk of staying. The risk of going was violent and uncertain and might end very badly, and it did eventually end very badly. But it was hers. She was choosing it with her eyes open. She went to sea with Calico Jack Rackham. She left Nassau behind. She left James Bonny behind. She left Woodes Rogers and his flogging threat and his shrinking, tidying version of the harbour town behind. The sea received her. And by every account we have of what followed, she was exactly where she was supposed to be. Life aboard the Revenge, women, weapons, and the open sea. The ship that John Rackham commanded was called the Revenge. This was not an unusual name for a pirate vessel. Pirates tended toward the dramatic when it came to naming their ships, and Revenge sat comfortably alongside other vessels of the era, named things like Queen Anne's Revenge, which was Blackbeard's famous ship, and Royal Fortune, which was Bartholomew Roberts's. The names were statements of intent as much as identifiers, a particular kind of branding that communicated something about the personality of the people doing the naming. The Revenge was not a large vessel. Pirate ships of this era rarely were because the whole strategy of Caribbean piracy depended more on speed and surprise than on firepower. A fast, shallow-draft sloop that could run down a merchant vessel or disappear into the shallows where a naval warship could not follow was worth more in practical terms than a heavily armed man of war that sat deep in the water and moved slowly. The Revenge was manoeuvrable, capable, and exactly the kind of ship that could make a living in Caribbean waters if its captain knew what he was doing. The crew of the Revenge was typical of pirate vessels of the period in its composition. It was small. Most Caribbean pirate crews of this era numbered somewhere between 20 and 50 men. The men came from a range of backgrounds. Former sailors from merchant ships, men who had served in naval vessels and jumped ship, men from the islands themselves, men from England and Ireland and Scotland and the colonies. They were bound together by the articles of agreement they had signed, which specified how prizes would be divided, how the ship would be governed, and what behaviour was expected. Into this environment came Anne Bonny. Now here is where we need to think carefully about what this actually meant in practice, because it would be very easy to romanticise the whole situation in a way that does a disservice to the genuine strangeness and difficulty of what Anne was doing. She was a woman on a pirate ship. Women on pirate ships were not simply unusual. They were, in the codes and customs of maritime life, actively prohibited. Most articles of agreement on pirate ships explicitly forbade the presence of women aboard. The reasoning was practical as much as moral. A ship's crew was a community of men living in extremely close quarters under high stress, and the introduction of a woman was seen as a disruption to the social order of that community, a source of jealousy and conflict and distraction. The fact that Anne was Rackham's companion and under his protection changed the calculation somewhat. The captain's authority was real, and if Rackham chose to bring a woman aboard, there was a limit to what the crew could do about it within the structure of their own articles, as long as Rackham maintained his position and his crew's confidence. But it also meant that Anne's position on the ship was inherently precarious, in a way that had nothing to do with her own capabilities. She was there because Rackham wanted her there. Her status depended on his. What the accounts tell us, and this is remarkable enough to dwell on, is that Anne did not behave like a passenger. She apparently did not spend the voyage confined to whatever private space Rackham could provide for her, waiting for the action to be over and emerging only when things were safe. The accounts, including the one that survives in the form of Charles Johnson's General History of the Pirates, published in 1724, describe Anne as actively participating in the life of the ship, in raids, in fights, as a crew member who was present and effective in moments of violence. Charles Johnson's account, which is our primary narrative source for Anne Bonny's story, and should be read with awareness that it was a popular account written for entertainment as much as documentation, describes Anne in striking terms. She was, according to Johnson, not at all reluctant to fight. She wore men's clothing at sea, which was both a practical decision and a social one, allowing her to move more freely in the physical environment of a working ship and to be read by strangers as a crew member rather than as an anomaly. She was described as fierce, as someone who did not hang back. There is a scene that has become famous in the telling of Anne's story, one that we will address more fully later when we get to the night of the ship's capture, in which Anne and one other person, identified as Mary Read, were the only ones actively fighting when the ship was boarded. The rest of the crew was allegedly too drunk to mount a defence. This scene, if it is accurate, tells you something significant about Anne's relationship to the work of piracy. She was not decorative, she was operational. The daily life of the ship was not glamorous. The Revenge and vessels like her spent long periods at sea between prizes, and those periods were defined by the tedium of maritime life. There was the constant maintenance that a wooden sailing vessel required. Sails to be repaired, lines to be spliced, pumps to be worked, bilge to be dealt with, which I mention because no one who has dealt with bilge water forgets the experience. There was the watch system, dividing the crew into shifts so that the ship was always manned and its course was always maintained. There was cooking in conditions that were challenging even by the standards of 17th and 18th century kitchens. There were also storms. The Caribbean in certain seasons is one of the most dangerous bodies of water in the world, and the vessels of this era had no weather forecasting beyond the observations of experienced sailors and the behaviour of the sky. A hurricane could overtake a ship with little warning, and in a hurricane survival depended entirely on the skill of the crew and the quality of the vessel. These were not background hazards. They were recurring realities that shaped the psychology of everyone who lived on the sea. Anne lived this life. Whatever she'd imagined the sea would be from the harbours of Charlestown, the reality of it was harder and more physical and more immediately dangerous than any description could have prepared her for. And yet every account we have suggests that she not only survived it, but thrived in it. She was at home on the ship in a way she had apparently never been at home on the shore. The relationship with Rackham seems to have been genuine, or at least as genuine as such things can be assessed from the outside. They were together. Anne eventually became pregnant while aboard the ship, which presented an obvious practical problem. An account suggests that Rackham brought the ship to a friendly port so that Anne could give birth. What happened to the child is not clearly recorded. Some accounts suggest the infant died. Others suggest it was left with someone on the island where they made port. This is one of the genuinely sad blanks in the story. Anne Bonny had a child in circumstances that history has not preserved in any detail, and what became of that child we simply do not know. What we do know is that after the birth, Anne went back to sea. This tells you something. She was not brought back by Rackham against her will, or pressed into service. She returned. The ship was where she wanted to be. The question of what Anne actually thought of her situation, what she felt about the life she was living, is one we cannot answer directly because Anne Bonny left no writing. There are no letters, no journal, no first-person account of any kind. Everything we know about her comes through other people's descriptions, Johnson's account, court records, secondary sources that drew on both of these. We are reconstructing a person from her effects, from what she did and what was observed of her, rather than from what she said about herself. This is frustrating for the biographer, and probably appropriate to the subject. Anne Bonny was not a person who seems to have been interested in explaining herself to anyone. She acted, she chose, she fought. She went back to sea after giving birth in a foreign port with an uncertain crew and a captain whose pardon could be revoked. She did all of this and did not, as far as we know, leave a note about it. The sea was her context, the ship was her home, and the Caribbean, in the early 1720s, was the stage on which her story was playing out, a stage that was about to acquire another extraordinary actor, Mary Read, the other woman who refused to be ordinary. There is a temptation, when telling Anne Bonny's story, to treat Mary Read as a supporting character. This would be an injustice to Mary, who had a life story of sufficient strangeness and courage that she could carry an entire documentary on her own. But Mary Read's story, and Anne Bonny's story, are so thoroughly entwined in the historical record, and in the specific circumstances of their time together on the Revenge, that to tell one properly requires telling the other. Mary Read was English, born sometime around 1695, give or take, and her early life was, if anything, even more unusual than Anne Bonny's. Mary's mother had been a widow who had a son from her first marriage, and then, after her husband's death, became pregnant by another man. When the legitimate son died in infancy, Mary's mother found herself in a desperate situation. The support she had been receiving from her mother-in-law was conditional on having a male grandchild to show for it. With the legitimate son dead and Mary newly born and obviously female, Mary's mother made a decision that seems extraordinary, but was apparently not entirely without precedent in an era of limited options for women in financial desperation. She dressed Mary as a boy and passed her off as the dead son. This worked. It worked for long enough that Mary grew up spending significant portions of her life presenting as male, learning to move through the world as a boy, learning to fight and work and exist in spaces that were formerly closed to girls. She was not confused about her identity. She was strategically performing an identity because performing it gave her access to possibilities that her actual identity would have denied her. This is a different thing, and it is worth being clear about the difference. Mary eventually enlisted in the military, serving first in the British Army and then in the Navy, in both cases presenting as male. During her time in the army, she apparently fell in love with a fellow soldier, revealed herself to him in private, and the two of them married. The marriage was genuine and by accounts happy. They set up a tavern together in the Netherlands, and then, with the particular cruelty that life sometimes deploys for dramatic effect, her husband died. Mary, widowed and without the life she had briefly built, found herself without means and without obvious options. She went back to sea. She enlisted on a ship bound for the West Indies. The ship was taken by pirates. Mary ended up on a pirate vessel, presented initially as male, and was eventually associated with John Rackham's crew, either through joining them or through capture that converted into enlistment, the exact mechanics of which the historical record does not specify with complete clarity. On the Revenge, Mary and Anne eventually discovered each other's identities. The account that has come down to us describes a specific and rather remarkable scene. Anne, apparently attracted to the young crew member, who seemed different from the others, approached Mary in the belief that Mary was a man. This created a situation that required clarification. Mary revealed herself. Anne apparently told Rackham, who may or may not have already suspected something. And the two women reached an understanding that they would both remain aboard and maintain whatever degree of discretion the situation required. The friendship that developed between Anne Bonny and Mary Read on the Revenge is one of those historical relationships that the record confirms in outline but cannot fill in detail. We know they were together on the ship. We know they fought together. We know that at the trial that followed their capture, testimony about both of them was given, and the testimony suggests that both were active and fierce. What they talked about on those long stretches of sea, what they made of each other, what it meant to each of them to have found someone else who was living outside the prescribed categories, we do not know, but we can imagine, or at least we can appreciate what the situation must have felt like. Mary Read had spent her life in costumes, performing identities assigned by circumstance. Anne Bonny had spent her life in a different but related kind of costume, performing the respectable colonial daughter that her father needed her to be. Both of them had made the same essential choice, which was to refuse the identity that had been offered and find their own way towards something that felt more true. The specific paths were different. The fundamental rejection of the given script was the same. Mary Read, by the accounts we have, was if anything even more directly physical in her engagement with the work of the ship than Anne. There is a famous story told by Johnson, and preserved in subsequent accounts, about Mary falling in love with a fellow crew member who found himself challenged to a duel by another pirate. The other pirate was apparently more dangerous. Mary, not wanting her lover to be killed, deliberately picked a fight with the challenger before the scheduled duel could take place, fighting him herself and killing him. Whether this specific story is fully accurate or somewhat embellished is unclear, but it has the texture of something that could plausibly have happened, given what else we know about Mary Read. What is clear is that by the time we arrive at the events of October 1720, which is when everything changes for everyone on the Revenge, Mary Read was a fully integrated member of the crew in practice, if not in the formal structure of the articles. She was a pirate. She was a fighter. She was Anne Bonny's companion and ally on a ship that was about to face the consequences of the life it had been living. Both women were pregnant at the time of the capture. This fact, which comes out in the court records, is one of the details that has always struck me as making the whole story more real and more human. These were not mythological figures conducting their adventures in a comfortable abstract space. They were women with all the physical realities that women have, living on a ship, fighting, navigating, doing the work of piracy, pregnant. That is a specific kind of existence. It is harder to romanticize than the versions of the story that leave the physical details out, but we're getting ahead of ourselves. Before the capture, there were months of raiding, months of the Revenge working the Caribbean lanes, building the reputation that would eventually bring down the attention they could not afford. That period deserves its own telling. Raiding, reputation, and the Caribbean in fear. Let us be honest about something before we go any further. John Rackham was not Blackbeard. He was not Bartholomew Roberts. He was not Samuel Bellamy or Charles Vane or any of the other names that the golden age of piracy produced, and that history has preserved with something approaching genuine awe. If you were ranking the pirate captains of the early 18th century by the scale of their operations, the number of ships they took, the distances they covered, the sheer accumulated weight of their careers, Rackham would not appear near the top of that list. He would appear somewhere in the middle, or perhaps toward the lower middle, with a footnote explaining why he is remembered at all despite the relatively modest scope of what he achieved. Bartholomew Roberts, to give you a sense of the comparison, took over 400 ships during his career. 400! He operated from the Caribbean to the West African coast to the waters off Newfoundland. He was a genuine force of nature in the maritime world of his era, a man whose name made governors reach for their correspondence and naval captains reach for their charts. Blackbeard, though his actual career was shorter than legend suggests, made himself so theatrically terrifying that his reputation preceded his ships by days and did half his work for him. These were figures who bent the Atlantic world around their presence. Rackham's crew took small merchant vessels, fishing boats, coastal traders moving modest cargoes between the islands of the Caribbean. This was not ignoble work, exactly, but it was not the stuff of legend either. It was the everyday bread and butter of Caribbean piracy, the unglamorous reality beneath the romantic surface. Not treasure galleons spilling Spanish silver, not dramatic cannon battles with naval vessels, merchant sloops carrying cloth and provisions, fishing canoes whose crews had even less interest in dying for their cargo than the merchant sailors did. The prizes were real, the violence was real, but the scale was the scale of a regional operation working the shallow coastal waters of Jamaica and the smaller island groups, not the scale of a man rewriting the map of Atlantic commerce. The mechanics of how the Revenge actually took its prizes are worth understanding, because they are so different from the versions of piracy that popular imagination tends to produce. Most attacks in this era did not begin with cannon fire and dramatic boardings. They began with the pirate vessel running up alongside the target, close enough that the choice being offered was unmistakable: surrender or resist. The merchant crew almost universally surrendered. They were not soldiers. They were working sailors employed to move other people's goods from one island to another. The goods were not theirs. The ship was not theirs. There was nothing on board worth dying for, at least not from the perspective of the men being asked to die for it. When a vessel with armed and clearly purposeful people on its deck pulled alongside and made the offer, the rational response was to cooperate and hope the pirates were not in a killing mood. Rackham, to his credit, or at least to his practical advantage, generally was not. The accounts we have suggest his crew took their prizes without gratuitous violence, released prisoners relatively quickly, and conducted their business with a degree of operational efficiency that kept the body count low. This should not be overstated. Pirates killed. The capacity for violence was real and was part of what made the threat credible. But Rackham does not appear in the historical record as a man notable for cruelty, which in the company he kept is at least something. What he was notable for, what made his operation genuinely distinctive in the gossip and testimony that circulated through Caribbean port towns, was not the prizes he took or the violence he deployed. It was who was on his deck. Anne Bonny and Mary Read were the remarkable element of the Revenge. Their presence on a pirate vessel was genuinely unusual in a world that had very strong customs about women and ships, and word travelled. Sailors who had been captured by the Revenge and subsequently released went to port towns and talked, as released prisoners always do, about what they had seen. And what they had seen was a woman in men's clothing who was present during the boarding, who was not confined below, who was not waiting anxiously for the violence to be over. A woman who was, by multiple accounts, actively involved in what was happening and apparently not uncomfortable about any of it. The Caribbean maritime world in this era ran on information. There were no newspapers covering the movements of pirate crews, no official bulletins tracking the Revenge's progress along the Jamaican coast. What there was a remarkably efficient informal network of testimony, gossip and harbour conversation that moved through the port towns with speed that official communication rarely matched. Sailors talked to other sailors, merchants talked to the harbour masters, taverns processed an enormous amount of intelligence in the gaps between the rum and the card games. Stories about unusual things moved through this network faster than ordinary news, because unusual things were more interesting than ordinary news, and a woman fighting on a pirate ship was about as unusual as the Caribbean produced in 1720. By the time the Revenge had been operating for a year or more out of Nassau, stories about Anne Bonny had reached the desk of Governor Woodes Rogers in the Bahamas and the rather more immediate desk of Governor Nicholas Laws in Jamaica. Lawyers was not a man who read these reports with philosophical detachment. He was a man who read them and then commissioned hunters. By 1720, the broader crackdown on Caribbean piracy that Woodes Rogers had begun in Nassau 2 years earlier was extending its reach. Naval patrols were more frequent. Colonial port towns that had previously maintained a comfortable ambiguity about their relationship to pirate commerce were under increasing pressure to choose a side. The King's pardon had cleared many of the major figures out of Nassau. The space available for piracy, the actual physical and legal and social space in which a crew like Rackham's could operate without immediate consequence, was shrinking with every passing season. The Revenge was working an increasingly watched corner of an increasingly watched sea. They were taking prizes along the Jamaican coast, using the island's shallow bays and complicated geography to move in and out of sight. They were visible. Their reputation had preceded them, which was both an asset and a liability. An asset because reputation was part of what made pirates effective. A liability because reputation was also what put you on lists. They were on the list. One particular incident from September of 1720 gives us the most specific and legally documented glimpse of the crew at work that the historical record provides. The Revenge boarded a small vessel off the north coast of Jamaica. The cargo was modest, not the kind of thing that changes anyone's fortune. But several of the men who were aboard that vessel were subsequently captured along with the Revenge's crew when the final reckoning came in October, and they gave testimony at the trial that followed. Their accounts describe what they witnessed on the deck of the pirate ship during and after the boarding. Multiple witnesses mention the women. Multiple witnesses place Anne Bonny specifically in the action, not watching from the rail, not standing back, participating in the boarding with the kind of a presence that made her memorable enough to mention under oath weeks later. This is the detail that separates the legal record from Johnson's popular account and makes it particularly valuable. Johnson was writing entertainment. However well-informed his entertainment may have been, the witnesses at the trial were giving sworn testimony in a court that was going to hang people, based partly on what they said. The incentives in that situation run strongly toward accuracy rather than embellishment. When those witnesses describe Anne Bonny as an active participant in the piracy, they are describing what they saw. The court testimony treats her as a pirate, not as a passenger who happened to be on the wrong ship at the wrong time. She did the work. She was there for the work. The autumn of 1720 had a quality to it that is easier to see now than it could have been then. The Revenge was operating in narrowing water. The Caribbean that had felt open and ungoverned a decade earlier had filled up with authority, with patrols, with the consequences of the Crown's decision to treat piracy as an existential threat to Atlantic commerce rather than an inconvenience to be managed. Every prize taken brought the crew more visibility. Every port where word of the Revenge's presence circulated brought the information closer to the people who were being paid to act on it. The net was drawing in. The crew apparently did not know it, or did not know it clearly enough to change their behaviour. They continued to work the Jamaican coast. They continued to take prizes. They anchored in bays that offered shelter and probably felt remote enough to be safe. They were not safe. They had not been safe for some time. In October of 1720, a privateer captain named Jonathan Barnett received intelligence about the Revenge's location. He knew which bay, he knew the ship, he sailed at night, which was the correct tactical decision, and he found exactly what the intelligence had told him he would find. A vessel at anchor, a crew that was celebrating rather than watching, a night when the rum was doing the work that the watch was supposed to be doing. Anne Bonny was a pirate. She had done the work, taken the prizes, stood on the deck of the Revenge in men's clothing, and participated in the kind of action that the witnesses at the trial would describe with specific and memorable detail. She had earned, in the most literal sense, everything that was about to happen. The night of October 22nd, 1720 was coming, and it was coming fast. The night the rum won, capture off Jamaica, October 22nd, 1720. Fix that date in your mind for a moment, because everything that follows in Anne Bonny's story flows from it. The Revenge is anchored in a small bay on the northern coast of Jamaica, in the vicinity of Dry Harbour Bay in the western part of the island. The Caribbean night is warm and dark and the kind of quiet that a sheltered bay produces when the wind has settled and the water is flat. The ship sits at anchor, lights visible on deck, voices carrying across the water, the crew is drinking. This requires a small amount of context because the instinct is to read the drinking as recklessness and leave it there. It was recklessness. But it was also something more ordinary than that. Alcohol was a structural feature of maritime life in this era. not an aberration from it. Fresh water stored in wooden casks on wooden ships went bad with a reliability that made it unreliable as a primary source of hydration on any voyage of length. Beer and rum lasted. Rum in particular lasted extremely well, and had the additional quality of making the other aspects of life at sea, the cramped quarters, the physical labour, the constant proximity to people you could not avoid, somewhat more bearable. Pirates drank because everyone at sea drank. The difference was that pirates, operating without the formal discipline of a naval vessel, drank more freely and with less consequence when they got it wrong. On the night of October 22nd, they got it wrong. The specific accounts describe something more than routine drinking. They describe a celebration. A prize had recently been taken, which meant there was something to celebrate and the means to celebrate it. The mood aboard the Revenge was expansive and relaxed in the way that only genuinely good rum and genuinely recent success can produce. By the time the danger arrived, most of the crew had travelled some considerable distance along the spectrum, between pleasantly loosened and genuinely incapacitated. The watch, if anyone was keeping one, was not keeping it well. The man who found them in that condition was named Jonathan Barnett. He was a privateer, which is to say he was operating under a commission from Governor Laws of Jamaica, which is to say he was essentially a legal pirate hunting illegal ones, which is one of those distinctions that the early 18th century Caribbean produced with a frequency that should have caused more philosophical discomfort than it apparently did. Barnett had received intelligence about the Revenge's location. The Caribbean gossip network that had been spreading stories about Anne Bonny and Mary Red for months had, it turned out, been spreading information in multiple directions at once. Someone who knew where the Revenge was anchored had passed that information to someone who passed it to someone who ended up in a conversation with Jonathan Barnett. He sailed at night. This was the tactically correct decision, and he made it without hesitation. A vessel at anchor in a sheltered bay, crew celebrating a recent prize, watch in an unknown state of reliability. You sail at night, you come in as quietly as the sea allows, you give them as little warning as possible. Barnett understood the assignment. What happened when his vessel came alongside the Revenge has been reconstructed from the trial testimony that followed, and from Johnson's account, and the two sources are broadly consistent even where they differ in detail. The shape of the night is clear enough. Barnett's crew came over the side. The alarm was raised, however, belatedly. And on the deck of the Revenge, in the warm Caribbean darkness, with a boarding party coming aboard and most of the crew somewhere below, and unable or unwilling to respond, the defence of the ship fell to a very small number of people. Anne Bonny and Mary Red were among them. Let that sit for a moment. The ship is being boarded, armed men are coming over the rail, the crew that has spent months taking prizes, that has built enough of a reputation to reach the desk of two separate colonial governors, is below decks. Some of them hiding, some of them too drunk to have fully processed the information that their lives were in immediate danger. And on the deck, putting up the resistance that the situation required, were two pregnant women who had no formal military training and every possible practical reason to stay below with the rest. They did not stay below. The accounts of what Anne and Mary did in those minutes are among the most vivid details we have of either woman. They fought. The specific mechanics are not recorded with the kind of precision that would allow a minute-by-minute reconstruction, but the broad testimony is consistent and was confirmed by witnesses at the trial. Anne Bonny was on deck during the boarding. She was not a bystander. She was engaged with what was happening in the way that someone engaged with what was happening gets engaged, which is to say actively, physically, with whatever weapons were available. At some point during the fighting, Anne went below, not to hide. She went below to find the rest of the crew and drag them back up to the reality that was waiting for them on deck. The words that Johnson attributes to her in this moment are the most quoted line associated with her name in 3 centuries of telling her story. She told the men hiding in the hold that if they had any courage in them, they would come up and fight like men. The actual language, filtered through Johnson's account and the standards of 1724 publishing, was almost certainly more direct than that. The vocabulary available on a pirate ship in extremis was not the vocabulary of polite correspondence, but the meaning was clear: get up, come up, the ship is being taken and you are hiding in the dark. The men did not come up. Mary Red, by the same account, reached a point of fury with the crew's collective failure that she expressed it in the most direct idiom available. She fired her pistol down into the hold at the men who would not emerge. Whether she hit anyone is not recorded. Whether she intended to hit anyone or was simply making a point through the most emphatic punctuation at her disposal is also not entirely clear. What is clear is that it represents an opinion about the behaviour of the men around her, stated without ambiguity. None of it was enough. It was never going to be enough. The mathematics of the situation was straightforward and unkind. Barnett's crew was armed. Barnett's crew was sober. Barnett's crew had the advantage of a prepared attack against a target that had been caught entirely off its guard. 2 women and possibly 1 or 2 other crew members who had managed to stay functional could not hold a ship against a boarding party that had numbers, sobriety and momentum on its side. The resistance was real. It was also insufficient. The Revenge was taken. John Rackham was captured. Anne Bonny, Mary Read, and the surviving members of the crew were captured. The ship that had been their home and their livelihood and their particular version of freedom was no longer theirs. The run was over. I want to spend a moment with the morning after, because it is one of those historical moments that the record does not preserve but that the imagination fills in with a particular quality. The cold light of dawn over a Jamaican bay. The Revenge still floating but no longer her own. Strange hands on the lines. Barnett's crew moving through the ship, accounting for prisoners, assessing the prize. The crew of the Revenge waking, those who had been drunk enough to sleep through portions of the night, to a world that had changed entirely in the hours they were unconscious. The particular cruelty of a hangover combined with capture, which is that the physical discomfort is so immediate, and the catastrophe is so large that the mind struggles to hold both of them at the same time. And Anne Bonny, awake and aware and already understanding everything that the morning meant, on her way to Port Royal, on her way to trial, on her way to the legal machinery that Governor Laws had spent months preparing for exactly this kind of occasion. There is something that needs to be said about the fact that the crew was drunk when they were caught, and I think it is this. It is the most human possible ending to the adventure. Not a dramatic sea battle. Not a last stand against overwhelming odds that produce the kind of narrative that songs are made from. A night when the rum won, and the watch did not watch, and a privateer captain who had done his homework sailed through the dark and found them exactly where his intelligence said they would be. Celebrating. At anchor. Unready. History does this constantly. It refuses to produce the endings that would make the best stories, and insists instead on producing the endings that actually happened. The golden age of piracy ended not in a great final battle, but in handings and pardons, and an unglamorous administrative process by which the colonial authorities simply made piracy too expensive to continue. Rackham's crew ended not in glory but in a bay on the north coast of Jamaica on a warm October night, when too many of them had drunk too much and the watch was not watching. This is not a condemnation. It is an observation about the nature of things. Adventures do not end dramatically by default. They end when the circumstances that were sustaining them stop being available, and sometimes that happens on a night when you're not looking. Anne Bonny had been looking. She was on deck when Barnett came. She fought when the men around her did not. She went below and tried to make them fight, and they would not. She did everything the moment required of her, and it was not enough. Not because she failed, but because the situation was already beyond the point where individual courage could change the outcome. The Revenge was taken on October 22nd, 1720. It was the end of Anne Bonny's life as a pirate. It was the beginning of the next part of her story. And the next part of her story was Port Royal, and a court, and the particular kind of reckoning that Governor Nicholas Laws had been building toward for the better part of a year. The morning light came up over the Jamaican coast the way it always does, indifferent and clear and not particularly interested in what had happened in the dark. The bay was quiet, the ship sat at anchor, and Anne Bonny was a prisoner. The trial at Port Royal in 1720 was not the Port Royal that older sailors remembered. The earthquake of 1692 had taken care of that. The original settlement, famously permissive and famously wealthy, had slid into the harbour in one of those moments where nature appears to be making a theological point. The rebuilt version that replaced it was smaller, more sober, more firmly under the control of colonial administration, and considerably less interesting to anyone whose business required looking the other way. It was still, however, a significant Caribbean port, a centre of colonial governance, a place with courts, officials, and a harbour entrance that had seen the bodies of pirates displayed in iron cages, often enough that the sight had become almost routine. This was where John Rackham's crew was brought in the weeks following the capture, and this was where the legal machinery that Governor Nicholas Laws had spent months building toward finally had something to process. The trial was an Admiralty court proceeding. This was the correct jurisdiction for crimes committed at sea, and the Admiralty courts of the early 18th century were not known for their indulgence toward pirates. They were known for their speed and their predictability. You came in accused of piracy, you were convicted, you were sentenced to death. The process from capture to execution was designed to be quick, and deliberately so. Governor Laws wanted the message delivered to every sailor in the Caribbean before the details of the capture faded from maritime memory. Piracy had consequences. Here they were. Come and see them if you doubt it. The trial took place in late November of 1720, which means it happened within weeks of the capture. That speed tells you something about how seriously lawyers took the matter. He was not interested in lengthy deliberations. He had witnesses, he had prisoners, he had charges, and he had a harbour entrance that was waiting for more gibbets. The proceedings moved accordingly. The prisoners were John Rackham, the male members of the crew, Anne Bonny and Mary Read. The charges were not complicated. They had committed piracy upon the high seas. They had boarded vessels they did not own, taken goods that were not theirs, terrorised crews who were simply trying to earn their wages, and they had done all of this repeatedly and without apparent remorse. The evidence was substantial and came from multiple sources. Sailors who had been aboard vessels taken by the Revenge appeared as witnesses and described, in specific and consistent detail, what had happened when Rackham's crew came over the side. Their testimony forms the most direct record we have of what the Revenge actually did at sea, and therefore the most direct record we have of what Anne Bonny actually did at sea. I want to dwell on that testimony for a moment, because it matters. Witnesses at this trial had no particular reason to exaggerate. They were not writing popular histories for entertainment. They were giving evidence under oath in a court that was taking the proceedings seriously, describing events that they had witnessed from the specific and not at all comfortable position of people being robbed. When several of those witnesses specifically mentioned the women aboard the Revenge, and when they described those women as fighting, as formidable, as active participants rather than observers, they were describing what they had seen. One witness stated that he had found Anne Bonny specifically as intimidating as any man on the ship. This is not the kind of thing you embellish in a sworn deposition. It is the kind of thing you say because it is true, and it is the detail you remember most clearly. The testimony about Anne and Mary is not the testimony of people who saw two women standing anxiously to one side while the men did the piracy. It is the testimony of people who saw two women doing the piracy. They were dressed in men's clothing at sea, witnesses confirmed, which was a practical decision as much as a social one, but they were known to be women, and the knowing did not seem to slow them down. Rackham and the male members of his crew who stood trial were convicted and sentenced to death. The conviction was not a surprise. The evidence was clear, the court was efficient, and nobody present was under any illusions about the likely outcome. They were hanged at Gallows Point, which was the traditional location in Jamaica for executing pirates, and their bodies were afterward placed in gibbets, the iron cages in which a condemned man's remains would be displayed, sometimes tarred to slow the decomposition, hung at the harbour entrance where every vessel arriving in Port Royal would pass directly beneath them. The message was explicit and physical and impossible to miss. This is what piracy produces. These are the bodies. Have a good look before you make any decisions about your own professional future. Rackham was executed on November 18th, 1720. Anne, by the accounts that have come down to us, was permitted to see him before the execution. She was given a final meeting with the man she had left her marriage for, left her father's house for, left Carolina for, left whatever remained of a conventional life for. She had been with him on the sea, she had fought alongside him and slept beside him and carried his child in a foreign port. And now he was hours from a rope because his crew had been drunk and his watch had been sleeping, and a privateer had found them in a bay on the north coast of Jamaica. The words Anne Bonny is reported to have said to John Rackham at that final meeting have been quoted in almost every account of her life that has been written in the 3 centuries since. She told him reportedly that she was sorry to see him there, but that if he had fought like a man, he need not have been hanged like a dog. This is a devastating thing to say. It is devastating in its precision. It does not offer comfort. It does not soften the reality of what is about to happen. It looks directly at the one fact that cannot be undone, the fact that the crew had not fought, that the rum had won, that the ship had been taken without the defence that might have saved it, and it names that fact without flinching. Whether Anne actually said these words or whether they were attached to her by a posterity that recognised how perfectly they fit the character that all the other accounts describe, I genuinely cannot tell you. But they have the texture of truth. They sound like someone who loved a man and was furious at him and could not separate those two things neatly enough to be kind in the last minutes available. The trial of Anne Bonny and Mary Read followed that of the men but took a somewhat different shape, though not in the direction that sympathy might suggest. Both women were tried. Both were convicted. Piracy upon the high seas. Guilty. Both were sentenced to death. The court was not inclined toward leniency simply because the defendants were women. The evidence against them was at least as strong as the evidence against the men. Several witnesses had specifically identified them as among the most active members of the crew. But then both women declared themselves pregnant. In English common law at this time, a pregnant woman could not be executed. The life of the unborn child was not to be ended with the life of the mother. The sentence could be handed down, but its execution had to wait. The court brought in midwives to examine both women, and the midwives confirmed that both were indeed with child. Execution was therefore stayed. Death was delayed, pending birth. For Mary Read, the delay was not the reprieve it might have appeared to be. She died in prison sometime in early 1721 before her sentence could be carried out. The cause was fever, almost certainly the typhus that was endemic in the prisons of this era, and that killed prisoners with a reliability that the executioner rarely matched. Prison conditions in the early 18th century were not designed with the health of the inmates in mind. They were designed to contain people until the law was ready for them. What happened to those people in the interim was not a primary concern. Mary Read, who had survived an entire military career dressed as a man, who had survived years at sea, who had survived a battle while pregnant and a trial for her life, died of disease in a Jamaican prison cell. It is the kind of ending that history produces when it wants to remind you that the most dangerous thing in any era is rarely the most dramatic one. Anne Bonny did not die in prison. There is no record of her death there. There is no record of her execution. There is no formal record of her release. She was in the prison, convicted and sentenced and alive, and then she is simply not in the documents anymore. And this is where the story stops being history and starts being mystery. The disappearance. What happened to Anne Bonny? The historical record of Anne Bonny ends, with any degree of clarity, in the months following the trial at Port Royal. She was convicted of piracy. She was sentenced to death. Her execution was stayed on account of pregnancy. She was held in a Jamaican prison, alive, sentenced, waiting. And then, with a completeness that has frustrated and fascinated historians for 3 centuries, she's simply gone from the documents. Not executed. There is no record of her execution. Not released through any formal channel that left a paper trail. Not pardoned through any document that scholars have been able to locate with confidence after 300 years of looking. Not tried again, not transferred, not recorded as dead within the prison system in any way that survives. She is present in the court record, convicted and sentenced and alive, and then she is not present in any subsequent record, and the gap between those two facts has never been satisfactorily explained. This is genuinely strange. The colonial administration of Jamaica in 1720 was not sophisticated by modern standards, but it was not so chaotic that people simply evaporated from legal custody without generating any documentation at all. Courts recorded convictions, prisons recorded deaths. Executions were public events attended by crowds and noted in correspondence. The absence of any record relating to Anne Bonny after her conviction is not the absence you would expect from simple administrative neglect. It is the kind of absence that suggests something happened that the official record either could not capture or chose not to. What that something was has been the subject of competing theories for as long as people have been interested in Anne Bonny, which is to say for a very long time. The theories are not all equally supported by evidence. None of them can be confirmed with the kind of certainty that would close the question. What we have, instead of an answer, is the shape of the mystery. Several plausible explanations, none of them provable, arranged around a silence that the historical record has never filled. The first and in some ways most satisfying theory involves William Cormack. Remember him? The Cork lawyer who became a Carolina planter who had an affair with his servant, crossed an ocean, built a new life, and then disowned his daughter for marrying James Bonny. The disownment, whatever form it took in practice, had not erased the biological connection. William Cormack was still Anne's father. He was still a man of some standing in Carolina, and Carolina, while not adjacent to Jamaica, was not so far away that influence and money could not make the journey if sufficient motivation existed. The theory goes like this. William Cormack, learning of his daughter's conviction and impending execution, did what he had always done when Anne's situation became legally and socially untenable. He made arrangements. He had done it before, after all. When a scandal threatened to consume the family in Cork, he packed everyone onto a ship and left. When his daughter's irregular origins threatened her standing in Carolina, he gave her his name and a place in his household. When circumstances required practical solutions, William Cormac had a history of producing them. The theory suggests that he or his representatives used whatever combination of money, legal contacts and colonial connections was available to arrange a quiet release from a Jamaican prison, that the pregnancy gave the authorities a procedural mechanism, a reason to delay and then quietly resolve the matter without a public execution, that the paperwork, if any was generated, did not survive, that Anne walked out of prison and back toward Carolina because her father, whatever their history, could not let her hang. This theory has genuine internal logic. It explains the absence of an execution record without requiring the prison administration to have failed completely. It explains the absence of a release document by positing a release that was designed not to generate documentation. It fits with William Cormac's established character as a man who solved problems through practical action rather than principled paralysis. The weakness of the theory is that it cannot be confirmed. No letter from William Cormac arranging his daughter's release has been found. No account from a Jamaican official describing such an arrangement survives. We are reasoning from character and from silence, which is a reasonable thing to do but not the same as having evidence. The second theory is darker and simpler. Anne died in prison. She died the way Mary Red died, from the disease that moved through the prisons of this era with a thoroughness that the legal system rarely matched. Jail fever, which was almost certainly typhus, was endemic. Dysentery was endemic. Complications from childbirth in a prison setting in 1721 were not uncommon and were frequently fatal. If Anne Bonny died in prison before her sentence could be carried out, the lack of an execution record is explained. Prison deaths were not always carefully documented, particularly for prisoners who were already condemned, and therefore, from the administrative perspective, already processed. If she died, someone may have noted it somewhere in a record that has since been lost, or may have noted it nowhere at all because the relevant paperwork felt redundant given that she was already scheduled to die. This theory is the least romantically satisfying and possibly the most statistically probable. Prisons in this era killed people efficiently and without drama. The fact that Mary Read died in exactly this way, in the same prison, at roughly the same time, gives the theory uncomfortable weight. 2 pregnant women in a Jamaican prison in 1721. One of them definitely died of fever. The theory that the other one also died of fever is not a stretch. It is the application of base rates to a specific case, and the base rates are not encouraging. The third theory is the one that attracts the most attention, partly because it is the most hopeful, and partly because it has at least some genealogical material attached to it, however disputed that material may be. Anne was released. She left Jamaica. She returned to Carolina or went somewhere nearby. She lived out the rest of a long life quietly, under her father's name or under a married name, in a community that either did not know her history or had agreed to forget it. Some researchers have focused on a death record in South Carolina for a woman named Anne Cormac Burley. The name is significant in 2 directions. Cormac is her father's surname, which she would have used before her marriage to James Bonny. Burley suggests a subsequent marriage, a second husband, a domestic life that followed the Caribbean adventure. If this record refers to the same Anne, and the identification is disputed and cannot be confirmed with certainty, she lived until around 1782. She died at roughly 80 years old. She outlived John Rackham by more than 60 years. She outlived the golden age of piracy, which was over by the 1730s. She outlived Woodes Rogers, who died in 1732. She lived long enough to see the American Revolution, to watch the colony of South Carolina become a state, to exist in a world that had moved so far from the Caribbean of 1720 that her own history would have felt perhaps like something that had happened to a different person entirely. This is a beautiful image if it is true. Anne Bonny, who stood on the deck of the Revenge and fought when the men around her would not, sitting in a Carolina town in 1780, an old woman, perhaps with grandchildren who did not know about the ship, perhaps with neighbours who knew her as a respectable widow, or a quiet eccentric, or simply as someone who had been around longer than most people and did not talk much about her youth. The woman who had been the most feared female pirate in the Caribbean, growing old in the place she had started from, watching the world complete its revolutions without her. We do not know if this is true. We genuinely do not know. And I think the not knowing is one of the most important things about Anne Bonny's story, because it is so characteristic of who she was. She spent her life refusing to be contained by the categories that the official world had available for her. She was illegitimate, she was female, she was a pirate, she was on the wrong side of every line that colonial society drew. The records that exist about her are the records of official attempts to deal with her. Court documents, colonial correspondence, a popular account written for entertainment by a man who may or may not have had direct access to people who knew her. These are the traces that the system left of a person who was always trying to get around the system. The records of her actual inner life, if any ever existed, are gone. What became of the child she was carrying at the time of her conviction is also unknown. She gave birth, presumably, because the execution was stayed to allow for the birth. Whether that child survived infancy, whether it was given to someone to raise, whether Anne knew what happened to it. The silence around that question is one of the saddest silences in the whole story. History has Anne Bonny in a Port Royal courtroom in November of 1720, sentenced to death and alive. And then history does not have her anymore. The Caribbean closed over her story the way the sea closes over everything it takes. Quietly, completely, leaving only the surface undisturbed. She was always doing things on her own terms. She chose the sea on her own terms. She chose Rackham on her own terms. She fought on the deck of the Revenge on her own terms when everyone around her was making different choices. Perhaps disappearing was also on her own terms. Perhaps the woman who had spent her entire adult life refusing to be where other people expected her to be simply declined, one final time, to be where the record expected her to be. The mystery will probably never be solved. The documents that would resolve it are either lost or were never created. 300 years of interest in Anne Bonny have not produced a definitive answer and are unlikely to produce one now. What we are left with is the person as she appears in the documents that do survive. Vivid, physical, impossible to miss, fighting when no one else would fight, present when presence required courage. A woman the witnesses at her trial found as formidable as any man on the ship. A woman who looked at the life available to her and decided it was not sufficient, and who found something more on the water that was. History has her, and then it does not. And somehow even that feels like something she would have chosen. The legacy. Why Anne Bonny still matters. Anne Bonny has been dead for at least 300 years, possibly longer depending on which theory you favour about the end of her life. The Caribbean she sailed has been transformed beyond recognition. The pirate republic of Nassau is now a tourist destination. The ships of her era are archaeological artefacts, studied in university programs and reconstructed in maritime museums. The world she moved through is so remote from the present that it requires active effort to imagine it in any concrete detail. And yet Anne Bonny is still talked about. She turns up in novels, in films, in video games, in popular histories, in the discourse around women's history and the history of the sea and the history of the Atlantic world. Her name carries immediate recognition in a way that most of her contemporaries' names do not. Say the name Bartholomew Roberts to most people, and you will be met with a blank look. Say Anne Bonny and something flickers. People know who she is or think they do. Why? What is it about Anne Bonny specifically that has made her a persistent figure in the cultural imagination when so much else about the golden age of piracy has faded into specialist history? The obvious answer is that she was a woman doing something that women were not supposed to do, and that transgression of gender roles always attracts attention. This is true as far as it goes. Female pirates were not common. The fact that Anne Bonny was a woman in a world that said women could not do what she was doing is a significant part of what makes her noteworthy. But this explanation feels incomplete, because there have been many women in history who transgressed gender roles and who have been largely forgotten. The mere fact of transgression is not enough to guarantee remembrance. Something about Anne Bonny specifically holds the imagination. I think it has to do with choice. Many of the remarkable women preserved in history were remarkable because circumstances forced them into unusual positions. Queens who ruled because their husbands died. Warriors who fought because invasion left no other option. Saints who endured suffering not of their choosing. These are genuine histories and remarkable people, but there is often an element of necessity in their stories. They became what they became because the world gave them no other viable option. Anne Bonny's story is different. She was not poor, she was not desperate, she was not trapped in a situation from which piracy was the only exit. She had a father with property and standing in Carolina. She had access to the life that colonial society offered women of her class. She looked at that life and she chose something else, not because she was forced to, because she wanted something the offered life could not provide, That choice is what makes her interesting. The fact that she chose, deliberately and with open eyes, a life of violence and freedom and the sea over the respectable, comfortable life that was available to her. She saw the cage and she walked away from it, and she did not look particularly conflicted about the decision. This speaks to something that people in every era have found resonant: the desire to live on your own terms, the feeling that the life being offered is not the life that fits, the willingness to pay a high price for authentic existence. These are not problems unique to the early 18th century Caribbean. They are as present in the 21st century as they have ever been. Anne Bonny, in her particular historical moment, lived a version of the answer to those problems that was extreme by any standard, but that contained a kind of clarity that the more socially acceptable versions of the answer rarely do. She also, it must be said, was genuinely skilled at what she did. The testimony at the trial, which came from witnesses who had no reason to exaggerate her abilities, establishes that Anne Bonny was not merely a mascot or a passenger on a pirate ship. She was an effective member of a crew that operated in one of the most dangerous environments of its era. She fought. She apparently fought well. In the specific circumstances of the night of the capture, she fought when the trained fighters around her did not. Whatever combination of temperament and training and physical capability produced that result, it was real. The pairing of Anne Bonny and Mary Red in the historical record is itself significant. Two women, from different backgrounds, by different routes, arrived at the same unusual place and occupied it together. Neither of them was merely following a man. Each of them had made choices that were specifically her own. The fact that they found each other, that they were together at the end, gives the story a dimension that simple biography rarely provides. It is a story about two people who found each other in the margins of history and who, together, were more visible and more formidable than either was alone. The representation of Anne Bonny in later culture has been, predictably, uneven. Some versions of her story emphasize the romantic element, her relationship with Rackham, the love story at sea. These versions tend to underplay the parts that require acknowledging, that she was a violent criminal who participated in robberies, and quite possibly in killings. Other versions swing the opposite direction and present her as a feminist icon in a way that smooths over the actual historical complexity of her situation. She was not fighting for women's liberation in any ideological sense. She was fighting because the ship was being boarded and the alternative was worse. The most honest version of Anne Bonny is the complicated one. A woman who was born into illegitimacy in Cork and carried that outsider status across an ocean, who grew up in a colonial society that had a very clear idea of what she was supposed to be and found that idea insufficient, who made a bad marriage, found a better passion, chose the sea, and lived more fully than most people of her era, whether they were men or women, who was also a pirate, which means she was also dangerous and violent, and part of a system that terrorized ordinary people trying to earn their living on the water, who died, or disappeared, or somehow continued without leaving a clear enough record for us to be certain. The legacy of Anne Bonny is not a simple lesson. It is not a comfortable endorsement of rule-breaking or a cautionary tale about the wages of sin. It is something more specific and more human than either of those. It is the record of a person who looked at the world available to her and refused it, found a different world on the water, was fully alive in that world in a way that people noticed and remembered, and then vanished from the record in a way that feels somehow characteristic of the whole trajectory. She was always doing things on her own terms. Why would the ending be any different? The 300 years since the trial at Port Royal have not made Anne Bonny smaller. If anything, they have made her larger, because history has had time to understand what was remarkable about her. She was not the only woman in the world of the Golden Age who found her way onto a ship, but she was among the most visible, and her visibility was not accidental. She did not hide. She did not pretend to be what she was not for long, not when it mattered. She stood on the deck of the Revenge, and she was who she was, and the witnesses at the trial saw it and testified to it, and the record, fragmentary as it is, preserved it. The world she came from is gone. The Atlantic that formed her is governed by different rules now. The islands she sailed between are tourist destinations. The pirates are museum exhibits. The golden age that produced her lasted a few decades at most, and then was extinguished, rather effectively, by the combination of naval force and economic pressure that empires deploy when they finally decide something has to stop. But Anne Bonny endures. Not as a saint or as a monster, but as a person. A specific, particular, irreducibly individual person who was born into a world that did not have a place for her and decided that, if the world did not have a place for her, She would find one herself. She found it on the water, in the company of people who were also looking for the places that the world had not made available to them. She found it in the motion of a ship and the particular freedom that the sea offers to anyone willing to accept its terms. Those terms were harsh. The sea always is. But for Anne Bonny, they were preferable to the alternative. That is a story worth telling. 3 centuries later, it still is. And so Anne Bonny's story finds its quiet end, or its quiet not quite end, here. The Caribbean that swallowed so much of the Golden Age eventually swallowed her too, one way or another. The records close, the trail goes cold. The woman who was loud and present and impossible to miss simply ceases to appear in the documents that were trying to track her down. There is something peaceful in that if you let yourself feel it. The chase is over. The sea is calm tonight. Whatever Anne Bonny found on the other side of the trial, whether it was freedom or a grave in a Jamaican prison, or a quiet old age in Carolina, she is at rest somewhere outside the reach of governors and courts, and anyone else who wanted to tell her what she was supposed to be. Let that thought settle a little. The idea that somewhere, at some point, a woman who had fought and sailed and loved badly and chosen well, and survived more than her era generally allowed women to survive, finally found stillness. She was always in motion. Everything about her story is motion. The crossing from Cork, the move to Carolina, the departure from Nassau, the raids, the capture, the trial. And then the stillness, whatever form it took. You can rest now too. The ship has come to harbour. The sails are down. The Caribbean is dark and warm and the stars are out over the water the way they always have been, indifferent and beautiful and impossibly far away. Anne Bonny is in those stars somewhere, or she is in the water, or she is in Carolina soil, or she is simply in the story we just told. That is enough. That is honestly more than most people get. Allow your breathing to slow. The history is done for tonight. The names and dates and battles and decisions can all wait until tomorrow. Right now there's only the gentle hum of wherever you're listening from, the darkness behind your eyes, and the long quiet that follows a good story. The sea is calm. The night is wide. Let it carry you. Good night.